Olá, pessoal. Hoje nós temos a alegria de entrevistar o Dr. Timothy Witmer, que é o autor deste livro, A Liderança Pastoral, um livro recentemente publicado pela editora Vida Nova, um livro excelente que traz as bases bíblicas, históricas e aplicações, dicas muito práticas de como deve ser o ministério pastoral, o trabalho dos presbíteros, docentes, dos presbíteros regentes. O próprio Sinclair Ferguson, ao falar sobre esse livro, diz que esse livro é uma exposição inteligente, bíblica, equilibrada, pastoral, fácil e interessante de ser lida. Então, nós vamos conversar com o autor deste livro hoje, falar um pouco sobre o conteúdo deste livro e trazer algumas perguntas que podem ser pertinentes e podem nos ajudar a entender melhor este livro e a fazer um melhor proveito também do que é ensinado aqui. Nós vamos conduzir a entrevista em inglês, mas se você não sabe inglês, não se preocupe, nós teremos também aqui legendas para que você possa entender o que vai ser falado. Então, sem mais demoras, eu vou trazer aqui à tela o Dr. Witmer. Dear Dr. Witmer, thank you for your time and thank you for your willingness to participate in this interview to talk a little bit about your book, and we're glad that's finally available in Portuguese. So thank you, brother, for your time.
Thank you, Jonatas. Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for your encouragement to get the book translated into Portuguese. I really appreciate that.
All right. So, first of all, I want to tell people what I think it's very unique about this book. I've read it about 5 or so years ago, and I think what's really unique is that you can find books that will give you a good biblical basis for the eldership and shepherding, but then sometimes they lack the practical and how to apply those principles. And also you can find books that are very practical and they give you really good advice on how to shepherd, but then they lack the connection with the doctrine. But then in this book, I think you did a really good job in giving a biblical basis, giving even a historical basis, and then connecting that to really practical categories of shepherding, and also how to apply that with very, very practical advice and also charts to help work. So my first question for you is, what made you write this book? What was the context? What made you think I really need to write a book on the shepherding ministry?
Well, I was doing my doctoral work at Reformed Theological Seminary, and came time to do the dissertation. And I thought that I would write something about evangelism because most of my work had been in church planting and church revitalization, and evangelism is really an integral part of both of those efforts. But then I began to think about the fact that so many times churches grow to a certain point and then they stagnate. And what I realized was that people were coming in the front door and they were going out the back door or the side doors, and it's because they weren't being cared for and they weren't being shepherded. And I also, at the same time, had students in my classes at Westminster Seminary. And as a good professor does, I sent them out doing an interview project with local pastors and asking the local pastors about what they're doing in their churches concerning shepherding. And I was very disappointed to hear that very few churches were doing anything in terms of caring for their people through the elders. And so it all came together, and I wrote the book, The Shepherd Leader. And as you say, I think one of the reasons that I've heard over and over again that people appreciate it is that it has a the how-to, not why, but the how-tos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And then here in the beginning of the book, on page 55 in the Portuguese version, you talk about the pastors, including the teachers. And just to set the context here, you mentioned a little bit about this on the previous page. So what's your view on what you mentioned here in terms of Ephesians 4:11, in terms of the pastor teacher? Do you see that as talking about one office and referring to the teaching elder, or is that, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I believe that is the office of the teaching elder, the pastor teacher, really the shepherd teacher, is the one who's primarily responsible for the ministry of the word, as it says in 1 Timothy 5:17, but also can't be disconnected from the shepherding role. And I think the grammatical power of that shows the combination of those roles in shepherding and teaching.
All right, good.
And then the ruling elders. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you can continue.
I was just going to say then, several other texts that I'm sure you'll ask me about talk about the role of the ruling elder alongside of the teaching elder, who share the responsibility for caring for the sheep. Yes.
All right. And then you say something interesting here in this quote on page 55. On page 55, it says that the pastor, including the teaching, the teachers, they're called to shepherd the flock, but not all of them have the gift to teach, even though all of them should be apt or should be able to do this. So I wonder if you could explain what do you mean by that? So you say that there are those that have the activity, they should be teaching somewhat teaching, but they're not gifted. Whereas I guess usually people think that if someone is called to a teaching role or being apt to teach in that verse in 1 Timothy 3 refers to being gifted to do it. So could you expand that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the scriptures make a distinction between those elders who are particularly gifted to do teaching and preaching, as 1 Timothy 5:17 and Ephesians 4:11 you just referred to. But there are other elders, ruling elders, and I believe that's what's the focus of 1 Timothy chapter 3, talking about those qualifications. And interestingly enough, the only competency qualification there in 1 Timothy chapter 3 is apt to teach. And so I believe that reminds us that ruling elders are responsible to have some teaching role. It could be, it could be discipling. It could be small group teaching. It could be Sunday school teaching. And some ruling elders are able to do preaching also. But the apt to teach, I think, there just reminds them that they are to be conduits of the word of God to their people as they shepherd too. Not necessarily gifted to that, right? Yeah, not necessarily. They don't share the same gifts as a pastor teacher. It's a matter of degree, I think you would say. I see. All right. So my next question would be, let's say someone reads your book and yes, I hope so. And this person gets really excited and he wants to start doing that in his church. So what have you seen in your ministry or with people you've talked with during the years? What are some of the difficulties
that this person might encounter, either with the session or with the deacons, because you bring them along, or with the church at large. And so what are some of the things you can anticipate that might happen, and how to overcome those things and be able to actually implement a shepherding ministry?
Yeah, I think you named the two primary sources of trouble in getting a shepherding ministry going. First being the session itself. And I believe that in the churches I've served, where I've always started has been to walk the elders through the biblical importance of shepherding. And most of them are usually pretty persuaded, because the Bible is very clear about that. I would say in one church, though, I had a guy who came up to me right afterward, after I did the teaching on it. He said, "I just want you to know that I'm not going to make any phone calls." And he was older than I was. I was younger at the time, probably about your age, and he was probably about my age at the time, and a very forceful character in the church. So what I did was I asked him, I said, "Bill, we'll start this way. Why don't you just come along with me? And when we'd have our prayer times for the flock, you can sit with me and you can pray with me for the folks I'm contacting." And I was hoping that would be caught by him, but as it turns out, it wasn't. But he moved away and went to a church. And the first thing he did when he went to the new church was take my book to the pastor and said, "This is something we need to do." So I guess he was persuaded. I think being patient with elders and being flexible in terms of bringing them along. But I would find it difficult to believe that the majority of elders would not be persuaded by the biblical texts. Now, when you come to the congregation, my experience is that most people in the congregations are very happy when this happens, as long as they are appropriately prepared, and it doesn't come suddenly a phone call out of the blue, but a contact that has been prepared in advance by good preaching and good communication. And I've had over the course of my life in ministry a few people who were not enthusiastic about being contacted, let's say. But of course, the way the contacts always begin is with "How can I be praying for you?" I remember one occasion where a young mom in the church, who actually had only come to the church because her mom had been a faithful member, and but she was a member nonetheless, and so she was on my list. And I called her and I said, "We're trying to initiate this shepherding ministry among our people because we think it's what God would have us do." And I said, "Do you have any prayer requests?" And she said, "No." Okay. So next month I called her again and I said, calling back Carol, and just curious to know if you have any prayer requests. She said, "As a matter of fact, I do. My son is going through some difficult times. And I really appreciate your prayers." And so that was the beginning of very good, vital contacts with her. And I think the important thing is that the burden for this rests upon us as elders and leaders, and it's our responsibility to do it, and to do it as winsomely and graciously as we can, but to do it nonetheless.
Yeah, that's great. I think you mentioned here also in the same page, you mentioned here one of the things I think it might happen because the people sometimes they have the mindset that only the one who's paid, he's the pastor. But then the others the others are not, right? And I don't know if that happens in the U.S., but I've seen here in Brazil that sometimes the only call that counts for people, even if ruling elder calls, the only call that counts is the call of the pastor, and also counseling and everything. So people usually think that they make a difference between the ruling and teaching elder in terms of let's say if the teaching elder, which we usually call the pastor, if he does not come to my house, I wasn't visited, even though the ruling elder came. So in a sense, that's some of the mind. I think I can see that in the mindset of the people. So my question then, especially with the idea of dividing here the people among the elders, how would you overcome that in terms of change that mindset for people to feel they're being taken care of, even though it's not the teaching elder that's constantly calling them? And then what would be the role of the ruling elder in that change of the mindset? So, for example, would you say that the ruling elder could say something like, well, the pastor visited you because I visited you, or something like that? Anyway, I just wanted to, how would you go about changing that mindset?
Yeah, I think the old saying is that disappointment is a function of expectation, Yeah. And in the church I recently served, we had 10 elders and probably only about 175 people, maybe 80 family units. And we, as you know, I advocate the elder draft, where you are choosing people, drafting people who are with whom you have some affinity, some relationship already. And it was amazing that I really didn't get any complaints, because the relationships between the elders and those people was so clear that they were not disappointed, I should say. But I think that the pastor, the teaching elder, has to be sensitive to particular needs and particular circumstances which are going to call for his expertise and involvement. So I had an elder who drafted one of our newer folks in the church, and she turned out to be big trouble. I mean, you really can't tell at first.
Yeah.
And but this elder is a young guy with 5 kids. And so I came alongside him and I said, look, I'm going to come alongside you and help you bear the engagement with her. And she was not offended at all by that. In fact, I think she had hope for that. But I think the wise pastor has to be aware and alert to those particular circumstances in which he is going to be called upon and, quote unquote, expected to weigh in.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then there's something here. I think it's also very countercultural in a sense for the idea we usually have here of the shepherding ministry. You say that that the pastor, which is here the teaching elder, should have less responsibility in some functions of shepherding, so that he has enough time to fulfill his responsibilities to preach and to teach the flock. So you can see, in light of what I just said, of the mindset, how this is. So could you expand on that a little bit, explain that, and tell the importance of this division of labor for the sake of the church?
Yes. I think that's one of the great benefits of a church having a shepherding ministry, is that the burden does not fall all on the teaching elder. Because, scriptures say that there are those elders who are called upon to spend their lives in the ministry of the word and the preaching of the gospel. And if that's the case, that takes time to do that preparation for preaching and teaching. And when elders are doing their role in helping to care for the flock, it really frees the pastor, frees the teaching elder to have the time to pour into his labor of the ministry of the word, which is his primary responsibility, I believe. Of course, he's going to have his share of shepherding responsibilities also, which leads to a question as to, well, what should the teaching elders' shepherding load look like? Well, what I recommend is that the teaching elder, that his flock be the families of the ruling elders. And so that allows the teaching elder to have an opportunity to care for the ruling elders and to interact with them as they're caring for their flocks as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Also, I think the first time I read this, when I read your book, it was really interesting. I had never heard about this, and I'm glad that you've included this appendix on term eldership. Right?
Yeah, John Murray, right?
It's page 269 in the book here, and on page 275, he talks about practical implications that goes against term eldership. And I really hope this here will foster a discussion in our denominations here to think up through that, because I know at least one denomination that has term eldership, not only for the ruling elder, but also for the teaching elder.
Wow.
So yes.
How about that?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, what among those practical implications that go against term eldership, which one of those do you think, or it's the strongest one that usually you've seen it's somewhat, maybe it's a strong word, but it damages the work.
Yeah. Well, of course, from my perspective, the main problem is the continuity in shepherding care. So that if a person is an elder only for a certain number of years and they've begun to establish relationships, it takes time to establish relationships with people. And suddenly they're not serving as an elder anymore, then that all that has been built up in that credibility of that relationship might be lost. But in terms of a solution to that, this is really hard, because a lot of denominations have this fixed in their DNA for decades or even longer. And at least this particular solution or problem can be solved, I believe, by encouraging elders who become inactive continue their shepherding responsibilities with their people. I've seen that function well in many places, and that without rocking the boat of that particular approach to the term eldership. I think one of the questions I asked when I was interviewing pastors about term eldership, I said, what's the primary benefit of having term elders? And the answer I got most often was, it's easy to get rid of a bad elder. So I mean, that's what they said. I'm saying, well, okay, and the problem is you also get rid of the good elders too.
Yeah,
and I think there's more under the layer. if you know you're only going to have to work with an elder for 3 years or 6 years, maybe you can let some of the personal problems you have with him go and not resolve them. And I think that's a problem. But I would say those are important issues. But I think the most important issue in terms of term eldership between us is that I don't think it's biblical. I'm not sure where you can find the biblical rationale for term elders.
Yeah,
it's a practical thing that, okay, I'm not saying it is not a practical implication of serving as an elder, but I don't think you can make the case forward from the Bible.
Yeah. One I think he mentions here, I think it's important to mention is that you create an environment of testing. So you're always testing that person, whereas the person who should be voted for to be an elder, he should have been tested before.
Yeah, we shouldn't be looking to the next election, so to speak.
So
we have too much of that in America, you know.
I know. Well, I guess everywhere.
Yeah.
And then it creates the mindset of, well, let's vote on this guy. If we don't like him next time, we'll just not going to vote for him again. Or also, you're always looking to your elder, testing him. So it creates a overcritical environment instead of environment of everyone doing his part and helping
and
each other
and trust.
Yeah. True. All right. Yeah. Also, I have here, it's on page 201 of the book in Portuguese.
Oh yeah.
The chart.
Yes.
And I think those categories are very helpful. You divide between the macro ministry, right, and the micro ministry, and then 4 areas of the shepherding ministry, which is to know the flock, to feed the flock, to lead the flock, and to protect the flock. And what it's interesting here is that you also put prayer and ministry of the word throughout, right? Because everything should be bathed with that. And one thing that's interesting, I was looking at each task that you put here, and it's good that it helps, because those tasks here, they will make one really need to pray and into the word.
Yes, right? Absolutely.
Because, we could get, as a session and teaching and ruling elder, we could get so lost in the administrative work. And so my question would be then, how, including everything that's here, what practical advice you would give to sessions and elders to help them not get lost in administrative work, but do this and also everything bathed with prayer and ministry of the word.
Yeah, I think the micro and macro distinction has been something that has been one of the most helpful things that people have mentioned from the book, because as I was thinking about the responsibility of elders, responsibilities, most people traditionally think of mostly macro or congregational issues that the elders have to deal with, and not the personal relational dynamics. In fact, I think that most elders traditionally think of themselves as macro, in terms of the 8 quadrants, macro leadership is where most of them live, making decisions, making plans, things like that. But the truth is that we're only effective in the congregational sphere if we're effective on the interpersonal level with people. So that how can we plan ministry? Okay, that's macro leadership. How can we plan ministry unless we know on a micro level what gifts are there among the people? How do we know what to preach and teach on the macro level? How do you know what to preach, what your next sermon series is going to be, unless you know on a micro level the needs and concerns and where the people have been in their lives? That all feeds into us as teachers and preachers as we're planning what we're going to preach and teach next. But I think one of the failures is in ministry is our failure to pray. And I have that as the foundation together with the word of everything, because this is a spiritual enterprise. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that. We need to remind our elders of that. And we need to remind our people that we're praying for them. When we contact them and ask them for prayer requests, that's not an idle exercise. That's an exercise in truly caring for the needs of the people. Mm-hmm. And you'll also remember that in the 7 elements of an effective shepherding plan, the last but not least is prayer. So it appears several times in this model of ministry, because it is a foundational, essential, spiritual part of our care for our flocks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And then my last question is, at one point of the book, you talk about going to the fathers, right? As a approach to shepherding. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could expand on that, the importance and also the why of that you found in ministry.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe that the family is the foundation of our lives. It's a foundation of the church. And if we're not ministering to the fathers who are to be leaders of the families, then we are failing them. I think men's ministry is very important to try to reproduce. And what this book hasn't been translated into Portuguese yet, but I wrote another book called The Shepherd Leader at Home that takes the knowing, feeding, leading, and protecting, and actually teaches fathers and husbands how to apply those principles in the home. And because I believe if our families are strong, our church is going to be strong. It's from the men of the church that the rulers of the church, the elders of the church come from. And I would say, I've been asked several times now that I'm old, people ask me, well, the first thing they ask me, they say, what is the best part of ministry in the church? And I say, the people. And then they say, what's the worst part? And I say, the people. So that's true. But then they ask me, if you had it to do all over again, what would you do differently? And one of my answers, I think it's the number one answer, is I would spend more time with the men of the church. Spend more time focusing on the future leaders of the church, because one of the questions I often get when I go from church to church is, well, where are we going to find these elders? Well, they just don't. You don't plant a seed and an elder sprouts up. It's an investment in the men of the church. And so I think that's why men's ministry is so important. And that's why ministering to the leaders of our homes is so crucial too.
All right. Wow, great. So Dr. Witmer, we really appreciate your time to talk to us. And also, we're thankful that you've written this book, and that's now available in Portuguese. So if you have a final word of encouragement, or you want to say something to the people in Brazil who might be reading or will read the book, you have the opportunity now to say a final word to them.
Yeah, I would say, just remember that you have a shepherd who loves you and who is going to enable you. He's going to give you the grace to do everything that he calls you to do. And so if he calls you to be a shepherd, I encourage you to look to him for the strength to do so. And if you're a member of a congregation, I would encourage you to support the elders of the church as they seek to do what God is calling them to do, which is to take care of you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Witmer.
Thank you, Jonathan.
May God continue to bless you, your life, your family, and your ministry.
Thank you. You too.